Some years ago, we went on a tour through the U.S., through the American Union, and one of the obligatory stops was the city of Washington, D.C. And so I asked our missionary, who also makes a part of our board and commission, Rob Owen, I asked that he take me to a particular place that I had always wanted to get to know. In Washington, I insist. I remember that the sky was gray, it was sprinkling a little bit. I covered myself with a scarf and a big wool jacket. It was frighteningly cold. The trees were naked, and that completed the scene. I walked down a very steep sidewalk, and before me I found the Washington Monument, the Lincoln Memorial, and finally an enormous wall which enumerated the names of more than 58,000 soldiers that lost their lives during the Vietnam War. The memorial of the Vietnam veterans. And it really shocked me. This is the wailing wall of an entire generation. Thousands of names inscribed in a marble tombstone, a never-ending list of soldiers who were killed in action. And obviously, behind every name, there's a lonely widow and a mother in anguish, an orphan child. And I noticed that some people had a sheet of information that you can find in Washington, and it indicates on which tombstone you'll find your loved one's name. And I heard a woman asking her son, "Did you find it?" She said, "Every name has a number." She said, "Every name corresponds to a number." And in that instant, I thought, it's true. Every name has a number, and sooner or later that number will be called. Sooner or later that number will be cited. And suddenly, I stopped concentrating on the letters and the names, and I looked at the wall, and I saw my own reflection on that brilliant marble. And so for some reason, I remembered that I had also been dying since I started living, from the crib to the tomb, from the uterus to the grave. It's a countdown. And that one day my name would also be written in a granite tombstone. And so I concluded something that we all know, but we repress, which is that death is the invader in the neighborhood. And we see it every time that we follow a funeral procession. It's in the waiting room when the doctor comes out to give the evening report. When they come out of the double doors from the ICU, death is near when we contemplate the photographs of people that are dying of hunger and that have a swollen stomach. It's also there, just a few meters away from us. When we're driving down the road and we see an accident with a car that looks like an accordion, and we see bodies on the ground covered with sheets and linens. Yet we see this and we forget that we also have a number, and one day we'll have to go as well. We're not on the wall of the veterans from Vietnam, but our name is written somewhere where the number corresponds to us. But we organize our lives around ignoring and avoiding or repressing the most irrefutable fact in the world, which is that all of us, without a doubt, will die. When I was younger, I remember that my mother read me a story called Death in Tehran. It's a short story which says that a servant runs to his wealthy master, shouting that they had just faced death, and that death had threatened him. So he begs his master to give him his fastest horse so that he could escape to Tehran, a distant land. And the master agrees. And later on, the master also encounters death and asks, How dare you threaten my servant?" And death says, "I didn't threaten him. I was just shocked to find him here when in reality, I was supposed to meet him tonight in Tehran." So it's impossible to evade that meeting. And the writer to the Hebrews in chapter 9, verse 27 says, "Just as people are destined to die once, and after that to face judgment." And I think the majority of us would like to make certain changes or edit this verse. It would be enough to just change one of the words and say, "Oh, well, death is for some, man," or "for almost all," or "anyone that stops eating well and taking their vitamins, they are the people that should die. But those that exercise won't die." But those are not the words that God uses. In His plan, we must all die. Even those that eat organic or gluten-free, and they take their vitamins, and they go out to jog every morning. Now, let's agree that exercise can give us a few more heartbeats, right? Medicine can give us a few extra breaths. A life free of mother-in-laws can really lengthen your health. It's proven. But we all have a number, and eventually we will be called. And this aversion to death dates back centuries. Yesterday I was reading that Rome would order that no body be buried or cremated within the city limits. That is why the crucifixion was carried out outside the city walls. That is why when you go to Israel, what Catholicism believes to be Jesus' tomb within the walls of Jerusalem, it cannot be true, and it's believed that the true tomb is outside of the city, which is the garden of Joseph of Arimathea. This is believed because the law was that the dead could not coexist with the living. They were seen with disgust. In fact, they had a city of the dead, which was the necropolis. That's where the cadavers were kept, because the terror and fear separated the dead from the living. Ergo, that would drastically change after Jesus. Because after Jesus' resurrection, cemeteries would even be installed on church grounds. There are churches that have their own cemeteries. Some saints, in fact, would be buried beneath the church ground, so that almost in a literal sense, the dead and the living would gather to worship. Imagine if before this arena, under this arena, there was a cemetery. Today you would say, "Oh, today I worshiped with Grandma." It sounds dark, but that's what they would do. The dead stopped frightening the living, and both groups coexisted in the same place. Now, why did people move so quickly from that ancient disgust to this new familiarity with death? Well, I insist, due to the resurrection of Jesus Christ. But for some reason, in fact, even as Christians, we forget it. Through time, our mind becomes fragile, and once again, we begin to feel that disgust and fear and fright and uncertainty to death. And we oppose death with such resistance. What surprised me most during the recent pandemic was the stupor, the fear of having to face death. It surprised me to receive letters and messages on social media saying that, asking how Christians should empower themselves, how to decree blessings. But like an atheist, they were desperate before death, and they asked themselves, how is it possible that this virus can take a pastor's life? Why is this virus also taking good people with it? These were questions that Christians were asking, as if death could only take the wicked. And so for years we said, for Christians, death is simply a change of address. That's what they say often at funerals. It's just a change of address. Yeah, but the move frightens us. We preach, heaven is a better place. We always say it. Those of us that will go to heaven. But we always have prayer chains so that this sick person doesn't go to the better place, that he stays here with us and suffers along with us. And if God decides not to heal them, then we agree, all right, they're in a better place. All right, then if they're in a better place, why were we trying to stop them from going to that better place? I say during my Presidente conference when I speak about death, that you always say these made-up phrases at funerals. We say, oh, they look like they're in so much peace. And you almost feel like telling them, well, where have you ever seen a nervous cadaver? Mother-in-law, our mother-in-law says, oh, he got ahead of us. And you say, all right, then follow after him, chase after him. And she says, don't be a fool, my son-in-law. What I'm trying to say is that last week, I spoke with him. And you say, well, where's the miracle? You should be worried if you speak with him the next week. The issue is that when we wear our black clothes in our mourning, we cannot crash against the wall of unbelief, of disbelief. We say, oh, now they rest in peace. Okay, but where are they resting? And in what way or how? Are they asleep? And once they're there, what do they see? What do they discover? What do they do? Because as Catholics, as Protestants, as Christians, we all agree that they rest in peace. But what are they doing now that they're theoretically in heaven? Well, in my childhood church, they would say, in heaven, we're going to have services 24 hours a day. But the thing is that our services were so boring that some of us considered hell. Because we would say, 24 hours of all this? I can barely stand 2-3 hours of having to switch from butt cheek to butt cheek. Imagine 24 hours nonstop. And when your spouse's breath stopped, when the beating heart of the baby in your uterus stopped, when the tone of the monitor in your grandmother's hospital room became one note, what do we do when we're close to that putrid death, the smell of death? Our lungs will also be emptied out. Our blood will stop pumping. And then what will we become after we die? Well, the answers vary. Some say we won't be anything. We'll just be food for worms. Whoever dies with an expensive Italian suit will be an expensive meal for the worms. Others say that we'll be ghosts, specters, just roaming around, trying to communicate unless somebody knows how to use a Ouija board or if they practice spiritualism, or will become toads, cows, cockroaches, snails, coyotes. No, not the one that smuggles you from. No, I'm talking about the animal. Or whatever we reincarnate into. Don't laugh, but I know a mother-in-law. Her dream was to reincarnate into a snake, and somebody told her, nope, you can't repeat. No, it's just a joke. Because then they get mad at me. It's a joke. No, they're good, but if they were actually good, God would have one. But, it's a joke. Now, all jokes aside, Paul writes to the church of Corinth, and in the first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 15, verse 54, he says, when the perishable, the putrid, or the potentially putrid, that will die in the democracy of decomposition. When the perishable has been clothed with the imperishable, and the mortal with immortality, Paul says, then the saying that is written will come true. Death has been swallowed up in victory. Death will be swallowed up in victory. I could live with just that phrase. Death has been swallowed up in victory. With that being said, if we ever want to make a tutorial on YouTube of what the protocol is on how to behave at a funeral, because there are some people that don't know how to behave at a funeral, because suddenly they make jokes, because of the nerves they begin to laugh, even if they're in a whole lot of pain. Others don't know what to say. Others don't know if they should remain silent, if they should speak. It seems like others don't go to a funeral because they show up with so much Botox and they say, I'm sorry. So if we would like to make a tutorial on how to behave at a funeral, then we should ignore Jesus Christ, because Jesus was an expert in ruining funerals. Maybe the reason is a lifeguard cannot remain seated at a beach when he sees that someone is drowning. He acts by instinct, by profession. A teacher cannot resist correcting a student when they use the wrong grammar. A police officer, if he's honest, cannot resist upholding the law even when he's not working. In the registry of the Gallery of Miracles, there are 4 resurrections that we'll find, in which Jesus was involved in one way or another. 4 resurrections. And the 4 hide a magnificent secret, a common denominator, that I'm going to give to you for the same offering you're going to give later. A secret that we're both going to uncover, or that we're all going to uncover together, a few minutes before the message ends. The 4 resurrections share one hidden secret. And just like Netflix, for example, I'd like to divide it into 4 episodes, or 4 resurrections. This is a mini-series of 4 resurrections, so that we capture the idea of the narrative. And here is the first episode. 2 multitudes converge. One that enters into the city and one that exits the city. It goes outside the city walls. Both crowds couldn't be more diverse. The group that arrives is all laughter and conversation because they're following Jesus. The group that is exiting the city, we already know what is done outside of the city. It's a solemn group. It's a flock of sadness, hypnotized by the elegy of death. And with them goes their reason of shame, a cold body in a coffin. The woman at the front of the procession is the mother. I'd like for you to imagine her. She had already walked down this path before. It seemed like it was just yesterday that she buried the body of her husband. And on this occasion, her child, her son, was walking next to her. Now, she walks alone, cloistered in a profound sadness. Hostile, rough moment. That sadness that seems to tear your insides up. And at this funeral, she is the victim because she is riddled with pain. She is the one who will sleep all alone in her home tonight. She won't have anyone to speak with tonight. And before her walk 6 men that are carrying the coffin which carries the body of her only son. She has no more family. If she had any tears left, she would cry. If she had any faith left, she would pray. But she's fed up. She doesn't cry. She's irate. She's upset. And both prayer and faith and the tears, let's say all 3, they're scarce within her. So she doesn't do any of these 3 things. She's only angry as she follows that wooden coffin. And Jesus' followers suddenly stop, and they make way for the procession out of respect. The mourning cloak covered them. They all feel the same lack of hope that we all feel, or that we felt when we've gone to a funeral, that one day our number would also be called. We all think that when we lower a coffin into the ground and we throw a handful of dirt onto it, we think, you know what, one day it'll be my turn. We have that awareness of death when we go to someone's memorial. So the only thing that was left for the disciples was to see the mourners walk by. Those that were carrying the sarcophagus stopped because Jesus stopped right in front of them, impeding the path. The woman doesn't know who Jesus is because he didn't come to the funeral, but before she can object, he says to her, "Woman, don't cry." Don't cry? Who is this guy to tell me that I shouldn't cry? What do you mean, don't cry? And the description is found in Luke 7:14 of what happened next. And it's captivating because it says, "Then he went up and touched the coffin they were carrying him on. And the bearer stood still. And he said, 'Young man, I say to you, get up.' And so the one that had died began to speak to him, and so the stiff fingers began to move. Imagine the scandal. We might say, oh, how great. I'd love to see how you would react if you're burying someone and suddenly the guy sits up and asks you for a coffee. His grayish cheeks blushed. The dead man sat up, looked for his mother, and the stunned crowd cheered and celebrated, while Jesus looked to his disciples, winked an eye, and said, you see that? There's nothing to fear. Here's the second episode. That's the first one, very short. This time it's a father and also an important religious leader, a preacher. And the man contemplates the photograph, which is placed on his desk, and with tears in his eyes, he looks at his 12-year-old daughter in the picture. Braces, pigtails, freckles. He had lifted up a wall of protection around his daughter, in fact, his only daughter. Maybe that's why these last days have been so difficult for this man, because these walls had come crashing down a week ago. It just so happens that his daughter came back from school one day with a bit of fever and irritation, and her mother sent her to bed thinking that it was a common cold or flu. But the following morning, after seeing that the fever didn't go down all night, they had to take her to the emergency room, and she never came out. The doctors, the medics, were dumbfounded because they couldn't diagnose her. They didn't know what was happening. Apparently, it was an autoimmune virus that had grown and grown and didn't allow the fever to come down. And so the father felt powerless. And like any religious leader, he was so used to showing strength that he couldn't remember how to be weak anymore. He didn't know what it was like to go through vulnerability. He himself minimized the situation, or he underestimated it. When somebody asked about it, he would say, no, she'll get better. This is nothing. This will pass. He assured everyone except himself, because inside, his emotions were breaking down, and what broke him was a phone call from the doctor a few minutes ago. The doctor said, I'm sorry, Mr. Jairus. Your daughter has entered an irreversible coma. Now this strong, even-tempered, stoic leader sat at his desk and began to cry. And that's when he remembered that there's a certain Jesus that calls himself the Messiah. He remembered that he's in the city. He always thought it was about a charlatan or a scammer. But there's a phrase that says, every man reaches a point where his despair is 1 millimeter greater than his dignity. And so he goes out into the street to look for this master or Messiah or whatever he is. He walks many kilometers until finally he faces Jesus. And he begs him and says, Lord, this is about my daughter. She's only 12 years old. You could do something. I don't know, a trick or whatever it is you do. Touch her so that she doesn't die. Jesus looks at him and says, oh, yeah, obviously. Take me to where she is. And then in that same instant, certain close individuals to the man put a hand on his shoulder and say, Jairus, there's no need to bother him. Let him continue on. Your daughter just suffered a fatal heart attack. Your daughter is no longer suffering. She's resting in peace now. And without losing his calm, Jesus tells Jairus, don't fear, just trust in me. The man doesn't understand why Jesus says to him to not fear, because he just heard that his daughter has passed. Finally, Jesus makes it to the emergency room, which in that moment was a true chaos. Jairus' wife is seated in a chair, pale without speaking, and Jesus asks again what today would be a dumb question, a question out of place. He asks, why are you crying? But he doesn't do it ironically. He doesn't do it to provoke them. He's truly astonished, asking, why are you crying? And then he adds, the girl is not dead. She's just asleep. And that angers the family members even more. I think Jairus' wife thinks something like, get this clown out of here. This is the last thing I need. However, Jesus makes everybody leave the room except for Peter, James, and John, 3 of his closest disciples, and the daughter's father, the girl's father. So the 6 were there, the wife as well, the mother. The girl was pale. Jesus takes the girl's hand and says, little girl, it's time to wake up. The girl opens her eyes, jumps out of bed. The parents begin to cry and laugh because they couldn't believe what they were seeing. The girl says, I'm hungry. And Jesus tells Jairus, yes, she's probably hungry. Find her a good burger with Argentinian meat. And if you're poor, at least find her a pupusa. Then he turns to his disciples, he winks an eye, and he tells them the same thing that he said to them when he resurrected the son of the widow. He says, you see that? There's nothing to fear. Here's the 3rd episode in the saga. This time, we see a personal friend of Jesus, Martha. She had waited for Jesus to appear to heal Lazarus, her brother. Also, one of Jesus' best friends. Then she had hoped that he would at least appear on time to bury Lazarus to show respect. But neither happened. By the time Jesus made it to Bethany, Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And Martha asked, what kind of friend is Jesus? And finally, when Jesus makes it, she confronts him and tells him the words, Lord, had you been here, my brother, your friend, wouldn't have died. And her demand was true. Jesus never appeared, not to help, not to heal, not to bury. And we all know that he knew about Lazarus' illness. And after 4 days, he comes along, calm. The funeral had finished. The grave had been sealed, and Martha's words echo even today. We've all said something similar when they tell us, rest in peace, don't suffer anymore. God, if you would have been here, my husband wouldn't have passed. I wouldn't be alone in this home. If you would have intervened, that baby would be alive today. If you would have heard my prayer, my arms wouldn't be empty today. The truth is that when we face death, our definition of God is challenged and our faith is put to the test. We tend to believe that death is no longer in God's jurisdiction, that God can do it all until death. After that, resignation. God can't do anything after that. Like when the doctors come out and say, we're sorry, we lost them. We say, well, God can only do miracles while they're still breathing. After that, it's not God's jurisdiction. And that's when Jesus cries out of frustration, not for the dead, but for the living. He's not crying due to the person behind the tomb because he knows what he's about to do. He's crying because those that are living, though they're free, they're imprisoned in their fear of death. And so what does he have to do to convince them? Hadn't he already shown them all with the son of the widow in 9? She didn't even ask for help, but Jesus still resurrected the boy. Wasn't it enough proof when he resurrected Jairus' daughter, who was already dead? And he said to her, wake up, it's time to get up. And let's understand this. Jesus wasn't doing a favor to the dead that were coming back. When somebody dies and goes to heaven and asks for a second chance of life here on earth, that's just Hollywood. It's just a fable for movies. Nobody that gets to heaven wants to come back. Someone says, oh, really? Yeah, you wouldn't want to come back. Especially with all the debts you have here, you wouldn't want to come back. Now, Jesus would bring them back just to show the living that death has been swallowed up in victory. Does someone believe it, yes or no? Now we're on the 3rd episode. They take him to the tomb where his friend Lazarus was put to rest in a cave with a big stone covering the entrance. Jesus' order was soft but firm. He said to them, remove the rock. In other words, remove the rock so that you can see God. Rocks, stones were never an obstacle for God. They weren't in Bethany 2,025 years ago, nor were they a stone in Europe 100 years ago. I was reading that a century ago, there was a countess, the Countess of Hanover, a famous German due to her atheism and her conviction that no one can find life in a grave. She had great public debates with Christians. And so before she passed, this countess left specific instruction that her tomb be sealed with a granite slab. She asked that around her tomb they place stone blocks, and she wanted heavy iron clamps. In other words, she didn't want to come back to life. And she wrote an inscription that she wrote herself. This burial will never, ever be opened up again. It's bought for all of eternity. It was a petulant way to also tell herself, I buy my tomb and nobody can get me out of this. She was sure that her tomb would serve as a mockery or a joke against the Christian belief of resurrection. But the old woman, the countess, didn't count on the plans of a small walnut tree, a tree whose roots were close to the tomb. They grew underneath and began to grow through the stone slabs through the years. The walnut broke the iron clasps. Just one small walnut tree shut the mouth of the presumptuous epitaph of the German countess, and Jesus is about to do the same. He says, move the stone, and he says, Lazarus, it's time to wake up. You've been sleeping for 4 days, like same way you tell your adolescent son, 4 days sleeping. And in the depth of the tomb, his friend moved. An immobile heart began to beat. His eyes opened up. And when the man-made mummy sat up, Jesus winked his eye at his disciples again, and for the third time he says, see that? No, I think he does it like this. He said, there's nothing to fear. And finally, here's the fourth episode, the final one. This time the protagonist is named Mary Magdalene. And before she met Jesus, she had 7 demons. She had at least 7 illnesses. I don't know if it was depression, bipolar disorder, who knows what else. But one day, Jesus entered her world. And so he just gave the order, and the demons fled, 7. And now, after following him for a great part of his ministry, she was a witness, an eyewitness of the crucifixion. On Friday, Mary Magdalene saw Jesus die. And on Sunday, a day like today, John 21 says, early on the first day of the week, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb. Her only purpose was to clean Jesus' beard from the blood clots that still remained and maybe say her last goodbye. She wasn't seeking a miracle. And early in the morning, she wakes up, takes her aromas and aloes, and leaves her home. She foresees a gruesome task because the body will be pale and stiff. The cadaveric liquid will make the body stink. And so she walks down the gray path, but the sun is coming up. And as she turns the last corner, her jaw drops because she sees that the stone that had been covering the tomb had been pushed away. And she immediately thinks, no, they stole Jesus' body. Mary assumed that some grave robbers had profaned the body, so she ran back frantically until she meets Peter and John. And she says, men, somebody stole the body. And so Peter and John, out of instinct, also run to the tomb. And as soon as John enters the tomb, he sees all the evidence, and it makes sense. He sees the shroud, the tunic, the stone that had been moved away, and he remembered everything that Jesus said. He saw and believed. And so now, this Easter resurrection had its first celebration. John and Peter run to tell everyone else, and since this is a mini-series, I told you that you would assume that the lens would follow them. That's what any director would do. They would follow John and Peter, because in the end, these are the writers of the epistles. They earned more than the actor that plays Mary Magdalene. But no, the camera doesn't follow John and Peter. It stays with Mary. And John says, now Mary stood outside the tomb crying. We don't know what John and Peter were saying on their way to the other disciples. As she wept, she bent over to look into the tomb and saw two angels in white. It was still early in the morning. Her tears couldn't let her see clearly. The two angels were seated where Jesus' body had been, one at the head and the other at the foot. And it seemed like one of these angels learned from the master and asked her, "Woman, why are you crying?" What? And the Bible says that first she's offended by the question, I assume. I'd like to read what's not written. I would assume that she's offended, asking, well, what do you mean? Why do I cry? They have taken my Lord away, and I don't know where they have put him. At this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there. Imagine what he said to her. Just guess. And then you say that I repeat myself. Woman, why are you crying? Who is it you are looking for? All right, let's agree. That's not a very common question at a cemetery, but ironically, it's the same question that we saw in the previous 3 episodes. Don't cry, woman, Jesus says to the widow in 9. He says the same thing to Martha. Why are you crying? He says the same thing to the mother of the girl, Jairus' wife. Do not cry, woman. The girl is asleep. She's not dead. She's sleeping. Why are you crying before the simple death? I know it sounds like an inconsiderate question. We would never allow any pastor, priest, or rabbi to come into our funeral and say, why are you all crying? Though, of course, our founder, Juan Carlos Ortiz, would do it. He would also ruin funerals. I never saw him resurrect the dead, but he would always come in and say, oh, but how great that they died. And the women would come along and say, oh, pastor. And he would say, oh, what a joy that he's gone. Ortiz would say, first of all, because now he's with the Lord. That's what we preach about all the time. And second, he would tell them, now you don't have to deal with them anymore. How great. They're gone. But I saw with my own eyes, Juan Carlos would say, how great, let's celebrate. Why are you crying? I know it sounds like an inconsiderate question, unless the person that's asking knows something that the one in pain doesn't know. And she says the word that she thought it was the gardener or someone else. And so she says to him, well, if you took the body, tell me where you put him. She didn't recognize her Lord. And so Jesus does something that he tends to do when somebody doesn't recognize him. He doesn't get mad saying, how do you not know me? He calls her by name. He says, Mary. I don't know. Maybe it was the way in which he said it. His vocal inflection. His tone of voice. The Galilean accent. The Aramaic dialect. I don't know. When I was a child, I could hear my mother's voice above all other voices. Based on her tone, she would say, Dante. But if it was Dante, then it's because she was upset. But if she ever said Dante Miguel, I was dead. But when she heard him say her name, Mary, she recognized him. And turning to him, she said, oh, teacher. Now what surprises me is that amongst all the people that Jesus could have spoken to for the first time, he spoke to her. All right, let's agree. Jesus took the gates of hell off of its hinges. He divided the calendar into before Christ and after Christ. He was the magnificent king of the universe. 10,000 angels were ready to serve him. And what was his first act? Who did he direct himself to? If this didn't have biblical backing then, people would believe that it was poetic license of a director from a Netflix series. Who did he speak to? Mary, the woman that once had 7 demons. It's not the same as 7 husbands. That's another woman. Why her? No book in the Bible bears her name. No story in the New Testament describes her work. No. And so why would Jesus create a moment, a scene for Mary Magdalene? Maybe to give us a message to all the afflicted and all the worried. Because our number will one day be called. Maybe he wanted us to realize what Psalm 35 says. Weeping may stay for the night, but rejoicing comes in the morning. Yes or no? So I dare to think that Jesus winked an eye at Mary and said, "See that? There's nothing to fear. Despair will not be our daily bread. Sadness won't last forever. The clouds can eclipse the sun, but they cannot definitively eliminate it. Night can delay morning, but it cannot avoid it. Morning always comes, but maybe not as quickly as we'd like, I know. Morning doesn't come dramatically or drastically the way we would want it, but the morning always comes, and with it comes joy. And so I know that there are people here and at home that need this promise, and you ask yourself, if on this night of mourning, if it'll ever end. And I want you to record this. Maybe the sadness can take our night, but it can never steal our entire life. It's a promise from the Lord. 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights, but not your whole life. Do we agree, yes or no? Paul says in the first letter to the Corinthians 15:20, but Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. The first fruit is the first harvest. And the farmer anticipates the quality of the rest of the harvest by taking a preview, a sample from the first batch. And we can anticipate our resurrection by looking at the first fruit, the resurrection of Christ. Today we commemorate the first fruit, the resurrection of the Lord. So what will happen when we die? Well, Scripture gives us a few guarantees that are fascinating. Since this is a book of jurisprudence, of laws that are fulfilled, it fascinates me to remember them. John 5:25 confirms, very truly I tell you, a time is coming and has now come when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God. Jesus ruins funerals and he will continue to ruin them. John says, the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. Now, anytime I visit a cemetery, I always imagine this moment. In fact, that's why I'm terrible at funerals, because while everyone is suffering, I'm saying, it fascinates me to imagine it. Because the majority of cemeteries are tombstones that can barely be read. In certain places, it's been centuries since anything has been maintained. However, the same Jesus that shook up the tomb in the garden of Joseph of Arimathea, he's going to shake up the land in every cemetery. The earth will be pushed out from the dirt. The coffins will be broken. The dead who have been forgotten by even their very families will be called up. And some think, oh, will it be like zombies that come out? No. No, those bodies will not look like that. That's another series. Of course, because the majority of these bodies are bones or ashes in the worst case. Nothing. Some were riddled by bullets. Some were burned by fire. Others were taken by illnesses. But 1 Corinthians 15:42 tells us how these bodies will resurrect. The body that is sown is perishable. It is sown in dishonor, but it is raised in glory. The body that is sown is perishable. It is raised imperishable. I've seen funerals where they bury grandma with clothes that grandma never would have dreamt of. It's guilt that makes us feel that we should send grandma to eternity as if she's going to visit Buckingham Palace. And we like to say, oh, we buried them with honor. Paul says, no, here we bury people with dishonor, but they'll be raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, but it is raised in power. It is sown a natural body, but it is raised a spiritual body. And all because of what? Because death has been swallowed up by victory. Death has been swallowed up in victory, yes or no? Now, I'm not underestimating what you feel. Without a doubt, death brings sadness. But what it shouldn't bring is despair. The tomb could not contain Jesus, and since Jesus is within us, we also will not be contained in a tomb. That's God's promise. God will call his creation. God loves to redo and restore. He said, I will make all things new. All divorce papers drenched in tears, all the inactive ultrasounds, all the invasive chemotherapies, all the extreme dialysis. Goodbye to kissing cold cheeks and beginning to kiss warm foreheads. Goodbye to so long. Goodbye to cancer, to metastasis. Goodbye forever to all this, to leukemia. God will call every sick body because death has been swallowed up in victory. That's a promise. On a Friday, the de facto government of Rome crucified Jesus on a cross, and then threw the body into a tomb so that it can decompose. And they said, that's all, folks. The spectacle is over. There's nothing more to see. The 3 delinquents died on the cross. Time to go home. But they were wrong. Jesus had reserved his greatest miracle for the end. And like a Broadway show, the grand finale is right before the curtain closes. I'm aware that death can take a whole lot. I lived it with my mother. Alzheimer's stole our last years of being able to speak, to converse. That's what Alzheimer's does, amongst other things. It puts memories in a shelf that's too high for the person to reach. Having to say goodbye to my father in a pandemic, he was alone. He said, all I ask God is that I die holding the hand of a loved one. But it didn't happen. My dad ended up dying all alone, as if he had no loved ones. He ended up being cremated by order of the government, so I know that death hurts. The death of my own brothers, a 46-year-old brother, he died because of a fatal heart attack. You don't just bury a body, you bury the marriage that never came about, the graduation you'll never see, the grandchildren that they never met, the vacations that will never go on together, the dozens of plans that we all had in common, that were intertwined, the golden years that we never saw, the anniversaries we'll never be able to celebrate. We don't bury a body, we bury dreams. That's why it hurts. But his word says that in heaven, these dreams will become a reality. Record this in the tablets of your heart. Hang it around your neck. Don't forget this. Our future with who left us is much greater than the past we had with that person. The future you'll have is infinite. God promised the restoration of all things, yes or no, of all things, and he will restore them. And finally, what was promised? The great secret that these 4 resurrections harbored. These 4 resurrections that Jesus carried out. And for that, I need to tell you another short story. They say that a certain missionary in Brazil discovered a tribe of indigenous people in a very remote place in the jungle. They lived close to a big blue river. The tribe was friendly, of course. However, they needed medical attention. A contagious illness had invaded the tribe. And every day somebody died. In another place of the jungle, there was a hospital, but it was separated by that river. In order to get to the hospital, the indigenous tribe had to cross the Blue River, an adventure that they weren't willing to realize, to carry out. They had the false belief that the feared Blue River was full of evil spirits. That was their belief system. And they filtered everything through that fear. Going into the water, to them, meant a sure death. And so the missionary carried out the difficult task of eliminating the superstition from that tribe. And he explained to them that he himself had crossed the river and didn't suffer any damage, any harm. He didn't have any curse. But that wasn't enough. So he took the tribe to the edge of the river, and the man put a hand and a foot into the water, and he said, "See, nothing happens." But they didn't believe. And so he splashed some water in his face, but the people still didn't believe. And so finally, the missionary dove into the water, swam underneath until he came out on the other side. And waving that the power of the river was just a farce, the missionary lifts his hand in triumph and says, "See, there's nothing to fear." He had entered the water and exited on the other side unharmed. And so the indigenous tribe began to celebrate, and they all got into the water because they had lost their fear. Jesus saw that people were enslaved to their fear of death. That cheap superstition of, "I'll never see the person that died again." And he explained dozens of times that the river of death is not something to fear, that life is just a placenta that we swim in darkness. And we see that little light that we have to exit through. We know that no baby that came out has ever gone back in. So it's not like you're going to stay in that dark placenta. He says there's nothing to fear on the other side. But people didn't want to believe him. And so he touched a young man in a coffin, the only son of a widow, and he called him back to life. His followers still weren't convinced. So he did something more drastic. He gave life to the body of a 12-year-old girl, and he brought her back to life with the whisper. He said, "Girl, wake up." But the crowds were still incredulous. Maybe they thought that, in reality, the girl wasn't so dead. And so he did something more drastic. So that there would be no doubt. He let a dead man remain dead for 4 days, his best friend in a tomb, and then he orders him to come out. Was that enough? Nope, doesn't seem like it. Because it was necessary for him to enter the river of death, into the waters of death, so that people could believe that death had been defeated, that there was no more fear. And after he did it, after he came out on the other side of the river of death, he said, now it's time to celebrate. They didn't believe him until he himself came out alive on the other side. That's where they were convinced that God has the keys of life and death, that no demon can decide when we'd go. The God that exposes the trick, the scam of the scammer called death. The God that we would like to be present at our funerals. In fact, he is. Psalm 116:15 says, "Precious in the sight of the Lord is the death of his faithful servants." In heaven, they don't cry when someone dies. No, they celebrate because it's one more person that has come home. Like Paul says, we shouldn't be saddened like those that don't have hope. The angels will escort us home. The day the curtain closes on this life, and we've had a good portion of life, and we have to stoically leave, God's messengers will take us on our last trip of life. In fact, God has an angel assigned to take each and every one of us home. And with this certainty, why should we fear it? He'll do it again. We can be sure of it. The same voice that woke up a young man in 9, that mobilized the still body of Jairus' daughter, that brought Lazarus back. That same voice speaks to us today, and now, 2,000 years later, he winks an eye at us and says, "Did you see that? There's nothing to fear. It's just a blue river." Let's go, let's go, let's go, let's go. Give a grand applause to the Lord of Lords. Give a grand applause. We're going to celebrate. We're going to celebrate the King. Hallelujah. Holy. Come on, come on. Don't stop that applause. He has risen. Beyond the blue river. We exalt you, God. The streets are made of gold and crystal. There everything is life. There everything is peace. Death and tears. No more. Sadness and pain. No more. I'll see the great river of life, clear like crystal. I'll see the face of the Master. There will be no more nightmare. There will be no more crying out. I'll see the eyes of Jesus. And I'll touch his body at last. There will be no more night there. There will be no more crying out. I'll see the eyes of Jesus and touch his body at last.
Nada que temer.
Nothing to fear.
Nada que temer.
Nothing to fear.
Nada.
Nothing.
Santo eres Jesús.
The nations will walk in his light, and the doors will never close. The city is made of pure gold. Its walls are made of jasper. Beyond the blue river, sadness and weeping, death and pain, no more. No more. Sadness and weeping, death and pain, no more. Death has been swallowed up in victory. The tomb is open. Someone needs to celebrate more than that, people. Come on, come on, come on. It's a day of celebration. Resurrection Sunday. No more. We will not worry about that anymore. It's a simple blue river. I'm not saying that you should be like Juan Carlos Ortiz, that from here on out you disrespectfully enter funerals celebrating, but it would be marvelous that between tears and pain, because we will miss them on this side of the sun, that we rejoice that, well, finally, the phrase makes sense. They just got ahead of us. They're just in the place where we're all headed to. We're all written in the book of life, and if somebody doubts it, and is saying, well, sometimes I doubt my salvation, sometimes I doubt that I'll find that person again. I don't know, maybe mother, father, children. And if somebody's thinking, I doubt that my father's in heaven, he was a bad person, he didn't know the Lord. I'd like to tell you something, even if this causes anger amongst religious people, the power of deciding who's going to go to heaven and who won't doesn't correspond to us. I know we'll be surprised. We don't know what goes through the mind of somebody in their last moments while they're traveling in an ambulance or in that moment of heart attack. All I know is that a thief crucified next to Jesus didn't even have to repent. He didn't even have to say a prayer of faith. He just asked for help, and paradise was promised to him. That is our God. Our God is a good God. So those that are on the other side, just say, Lord, come into my life. I'd like to assure my passport to be able to re-encounter my loved ones and everyone here. Let's take a last moment to pray. Close your eyes and let's pray together. Father, thank you for this moment. Thank you for this crib of champions, for these frontline workers. I've spoken what I believe you told me to say and what you've placed in my heart. I haven't omitted or taken from what I believe is your revelation. And even then, foolishly, I've only been able to speak to their intellect, which is as far as I can get. But I know that your Holy Spirit has consoled, comforted, has brought out tears and healed wounds, has gone into the deepest corners of each soul. Lord, I'm free from this word. I'm no longer responsible for it because the word has been given and now inhabit in each heart. And besides, this word will remain in a time capsule on the online. And through the years, people that go through pain again will remember that though we're in the valley of shadow and death, you will escort us through. We won't be alone. And when our name or our loved ones' names are called, we'll be ready. When the list is called, we'll be ready. Thank you, Lord, because today you speak to us. Because today we celebrate that mixture of emotions, of sadness, but also joy for that empty and open tomb. My loved ones, may the Lord bless you. May He keep you. May the Lord make His face shine on you. There is no tomb that can contain you. Christ lives in you, and that breaks those stone slabs. Celebrate, celebrate with a great applause. Happy Easter. Happy Easter. Happy Resurrection Sunday. That applause is for the Lord of Lords and King of Kings. Bye. Firm like a bear claw. Until next Sunday. Blessings.
Apareciste una noche de soledad, abandonado y perdido te reconocí. Tu voz diciéndome no temas, yo estoy aquí. El Padre me envió por ti y me curaste las heridas, me sanaste, mi Jesús. Todas mis cargas las dejaste allí en la cruz. Algo tan grande no lo puedo comprender. Oigo tu dulce voz diciéndome una y otra vez: oh, 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 eres bienvenido, eres amado una y otra vez. Oh, 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 bienvenido a River, eres amado. Apareciste en una noche de soledad, abandonado y perdido te reconocí. Tu voz diciéndome no temas, yo estoy aquí. El Padre me envió por ti y Me curaste las heridas, me sanaste, mi Jesús. Todas mis cargas las dejaste allí en la cruz.